In this lesson, we're going to take this use lesson composable that we have already created, and we're going to turn it into a more generic composable. So right now, this function or this composable lets us fetch data from the lesson endpoint, but we also want to fetch data from our course meta endpoint. And we'd like to be able to do it in a similar way using this session storage caching layer that we've put on top of this data here. So what I'm going to do is actually to copy and paste this into a new file, and then we'll modify it from there. So now we're working in our useFetchWithCache.ts file. Now we're going to work through and make this more generic so that we can use it with any endpoint that we want. So the first thing that we need to do is, instead of passing in slugs here like this, we're going to instead pass in the URL straight up. And we'll specify that that is still a string. Then, of course, we can get rid of that line. And now we're going to rename this lesson here, and we're just going to call it cached, because that's a bit more generic term here. Say cache.value, cached, and we'll return the cached value. We'll update our status message to be a bit more generic as well. And then this message here, when we have a cache hit, will also make this more generic. So now we have a pretty generic composable that we can use with any URL, and it will automatically give us this session storage cache layer. But one issue that we have is that we're still using this lesson with path type. Luckily, TypeScript gives us a way to create more reusable functions using generic types. You can think of these sort of like arguments for types. And so that's exactly what these arguments are doing here, or these angle brackets are doing here. This use session storage is a generic composable, and we can pass in any type to it to tell it what type to expect. And we're going to make our function here work exactly the same. So right up here, we're going to put a T, and this means that this is the type of this function. And then instead of lesson with path, we'll replace that with this generic type T. The name here doesn't really matter. You can name it whatever you want, but T is a common variable name. It's used for this generic type. And basically what this lets us do is say that whatever type we want to use this composable with, we just pass it in here. And then we'll take that type, we'll pass it along to this use session storage. And then this use session storage knows that this cached value here is a removable ref of type T, whatever T happens to be, of course. And our entire function continues on in this way, that use fetch of type T. So we're going to get data back that's of type T, and we continue on. Now in this spot here, TypeScript has a little bit of issues with figuring out what's going on here. And so one trick that we can do with TypeScript is to cast from one type to another. So in this instance, TypeScript doesn't know exactly what type data.value is supposed to be. But from looking at this code, I can say that data.value is for sure going to be type T, because it's coming from this useFetch here. And so I'm basically just going to override whatever TypeScript thinks is going on here and tell it that for sure data.value is type T, so therefore we can set it to cache.value. Now this as casting here can get you into some trouble because you are overriding TypeScript. So if you override it incorrectly, then you're basically shooting yourself in the foot and invalidating all of that value that TypeScript is there for in the first place. Okay, so now we have our cached generic composable for fetching data. Now we need to refactor useLesson to use this instead. And it's actually very straightforward. In fact, what we're going to do is remove this import here because we do not need that. And so the first thing that we need to do is basically get rid of all of this. We do need to create our own URL here to pass in. But we can call useFetchWithCache and then use the template as an argument there. Now, this is where the generics come in again. Because we have not provided the lesson with path type, TypeScript does not know what this value is, and we get this unknown here. So just like we did with the use session storage method, where we passed in this type T, we're going to do the same thing here. We can pass in the type lesson with path. And now we're able to infer that this fetch here will pass in a lesson with path, and what we're going to get back is a promise that contains a removable ref of type lesson with path. We can also get rid of that import that we don't need, and we're good to go. Now that we have this useFetchWithCache composable, we can now use it to fetch data from our course meta endpoint, which we'll do in the next lesson.